Monday, AD 30, 4 days before his death. Early the next day, Jesus departed with his disciples from Bethany, and they arrived at the Mount of Olives. This area was a sort of suburb of Jerusalem, and it overlooked the city on its eastern side. And while the vast majority of churches around the planet celebrate these events that we're going to be talking about today as Palm Sunday, from my research, it's likely that they actually occurred on Monday morning. While at the Mount of Olives, Jesus instructed 2 of his followers to go into an adjacent town and to bring him a new mule that had never been ridden, Matthew 11, 1 through 8. This was a tremendous honor in the ancient world and one of the nicest things that was done for Jesus in his final week. It would have been on a new mule that the Lord Jesus would ride into Jerusalem with tears flooding down his eyes, Luke 19, 41 through 44. 3 things became crystal clear in that display. First, as he rode toward the looming city on the back of the bumbling colt, he was fulfilling messianic expectations for the end-time king. Even though the disciples didn't immediately understand it, this is what he was doing, John 12:16. In Zechariah 9, 9 through 10, which was written 500 years before this event, the prophet foretold that a final king, a son of David, would ride into Israel and into Jerusalem victoriously, humbly on a donkey, and he would set up an eternal kingdom from that point forward. In Zechariah 9:10, we discover that this is an eternal kingdom, that it will bring God's shalom and peace and hope to all the nations. Jesus most certainly began that work then, and he continues that work today. That's the first thing we learn. The second thing that we learn is, just as Solomon had done before him in 1 Kings chapter 1, 33 through 37, Jesus rode into the city on the back of a donkey as the true son of David. Like Solomon, he did this to announce his kingdom and his reign to all the nation. Like Solomon, who rode on the donkey long before, men and women were celebrating as Jesus went along, Mark 11:9. But unlike Solomon, who had a crown put on his head when he arrived, soon Jesus would have a different kind of crown put on his brow. It was a crown of thorns. Unlike Solomon, who was elevated to a fancy throne, Jesus would be elevated on a rugged cross. And while the prestige and the splendor of Solomon's house may look like victory, and while the scourging of Jesus and his gruesome death may actually look like defeat, Jesus shows us that he and his kingdom are greater than Solomon's ever could be. For at the end of Solomon's life, he was in love with various idols, and he bowed the knee to them on every high place in Israel. Not so with Jesus. Instead of bowing his knee on the high place, he was elevated on the high place. He is the one who is enthroned now, still enthroned as king, with a kingdom that will never end. That's the second thing we learn. The third thing that we learn is, as Jesus rode into the city, he wept, and he wept bitterly, because Jerusalem is the city that kills the prophets. It was the city that God would send his prophets, and he would ultimately send his son. And it's the city who would grab hold of God's beloved child and murder him. And in so doing, God would take away the kingdom from them, and he would give it to a people who bear its fruit. Matthew 21:43. After the pomp and circumstance that was awaiting him in the city of Jerusalem, the Lord went to one last time to the Temple Mount. He dismounted from the donkey's colt, and he marched to the Temple's Mount before leaving the city. He went to see the temple in peace before he would see it again in his arrest. He went to look at it before he was embroiled in controversy. And it was likely that he went to weep over the temple as well. And it's likely that he went to pray, and he went to think through the actions that he was going to be undertaking the very next day, when he would cleanse the temple, Mark 11:15 through 17. As evening approached, and as Jesus stood in the shadow of the looming temple, and his disciples were there with him, he decided to leave the city, and he returned back to the town called Bethany, where he would await the dramatic events of Tuesday morning, Mark 11:11. With that, I invite you to join us tomorrow as we explore what Jesus was doing on his final Tuesday. God bless you.